Tonight on CBC Vancouver News.
We stand to lose everything if the winds blow the fire back into Topanga.
As people brace for more strong winds in and around fire-ravaged LA, BC is sending support.
These are individuals who understand aviation, advanced planning, weather modeling.
Plus,
electricity as well as natural gas. These are significant economic drivers for the United States.
I think oil and gas is going to be key to being able to get a breakthrough.
Different premiers, different approaches to Trump tariffs. How BC, Alberta, and others are responding to the threats.
I don't think they all have to be competing to get a meeting with Trump.
And she starved to death in a home share in Port Coquitlam. Now a coroner's inquest has begun into the death of a disabled woman more than 6 years ago.
This is CBC Vancouver News.
Hello, I'm Dan Burritt. Thanks for joining us. There are fresh worries of more wildfire destruction in the Los Angeles area. Firefighters had managed to make some progress over the weekend. The blazes have killed at least 24 people and wiped out thousands of homes. But now, as Steve Futterman shows us, winds are picking up once again.
Los Angeles is on edge, facing the one thing it doesn't want. New winds have arrived. Stronger winds are coming.
Severe fire weather conditions will continue through Wednesday. Please be assured that all fire departments and all law enforcement agencies in the area will be prepared.
And there is fear among those who live here that their homes could be the next victims of fires that have ravaged and shocked this city.
We stand to lose everything if the winds blow the fire back into Topanga and it burns the whole of Fernwood and Topanga down.
I actually don't know where I would go, to be honest. I don't have family here. I have friends, but they're all affected.
My mom's street, you can actually see through the two the street behind and the street in front.
We're going through the stages of grief, there's no doubt about it.
Nearly a week after these fires broke out, it's still hard to really comprehend the totality of the damage in places like this here in Pacific Palisades. And with the new winds coming up, the one thing officials don't want is a repeat. Fire crews and engine companies have been strategically pre-positioned, placed in vulnerable areas where new fires could start or previously extinguished fires could reignite.
We are not in the clear as of yet, and we must not let our guard down, as we have right now extreme fire behavior.
As preparations for the winds are in place, the grim search for remains among the ruins goes on. Remains of people who either wouldn't leave or couldn't leave. Also today, the first criminal charges against those allegedly involved in looting. One person was also charged with arson in a case not related to these fires.
These people who've committed these crimes are facing very significant sentences. So the criminals have decided that this is an opportunity, and I'm here to tell you that this is not an opportunity. You will be arrested, you will be prosecuted, and you will be punished.
The strongest winds are expected tomorrow through Wednesday. The forecast calls for wind gusts over 100 kilometers an hour. Steve Futterman for CBC News, Los Angeles.
Amid those challenges, BC is sending support to California. Ground personnel from this province have departed for LA. And as Michelle Gassoub reports, they join a growing number of Canadian support teams stepping up to help.
23 BC Wildfire Service members are on their way to LA, making the long drive down with firefighting equipment in tow, almost certainly heading into intense firefighting conditions.
So it's pretty much the most highly trained firefighter, wildland firefighter that you can have. So I think the big difference is obviously going to be environment, different fuel type in Southern California. So that impacts how fire moves.
BC has also sent 12 senior technical specialists who traveled into the fire zone over the weekend.
These are individuals who understand aviation, advanced planning, weather modeling, and a whole host of other things. And this was a request from California Fire.
It's a Team Canada approach. 42 fire personnel from Alberta are headed south, and 2 more Quebec aircraft will be sent down. It's not just Canadian government resources assisting to fight the flames. Coulson Aviation is a BC company supplying planes to several counties in California. They've developed special technology that allows them to fly at night.
The heat's gone because the sun's down. So what we're seeing is that our drops are 2 to 3 times to 4 times more effective at night than during the day.
The company also uses lasers that track heat, allowing them to hone in on hotspots.
We see the ground in with goggles, night vision goggles, but the camera in the Overwatch helicopter sees it in thermal, so it sees the heat. So we're able to pinpoint where the hotspots are around the fire.
BC personnel arriving in LA will join a massive firefighting effort, as thousands are already on the fire lines.
Far different than in BC, where a big fire might have several hundred people. I think on one of the fires there's roughly 5,000 people on just a single fire. So the scale of the machine that's working there is much bigger than in BC.
The wind that whipped the LA fires from spark to inferno is roaring again. Conditions are forecasted to be severe until at least Wednesday. Michelle Gassoub, CBC News, Vancouver.
With 1 week until Donald Trump is inaugurated as U.S. president again, the threat of tariffs looms. As Katie DeRosa explains, some premiers are taking a one-on-one approach to negotiating with Trump.
Many have called for a Team Canada approach to Donald Trump's tariff threat, but some provinces are going it alone.
I think we need to be prepared that tariffs are coming.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith met with the incoming U.S. president over the weekend at Mar-a-Lago, his Florida golf club. She's the first premier to do so since Trump announced his threat of 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. Smith is pushing for carve-outs or exemptions, particularly on energy products.
Because I think oil and gas is going to be key to being able to get a breakthrough once tariffs do come in getting them off.
Crude oil accounts for 1/5 of all goods Canada ships abroad.
If I was the premier, I would already be down there.
BC Conservative leader John Rustad accuses Premier David Eby of dropping the ball by not setting up his own meeting with Trump.
I think what we're seeing, quite frankly, is not a coordinated approach. We've got obviously disorganization that's coming out of Ottawa, but also, when you have a disjointed approach, every province should be looking after itself.
One political watcher says Smith's strategy to go it alone could hurt Canada's position as a whole.
That if we don't stand together on this, we all stand to lose. We are becoming more vulnerable the more divided we are.
The president of the BC Business Council says it makes sense for Smith to meet with Trump while Eby works his contacts with Democratic governors like California's Gavin Newsom.
The premiers are leveraging their very different strengths. So I don't think they all have to be competing to get a meeting with Trump.
Eby says his trump card in negotiations would be threatening to hold back exports the U.S. relies on.
I'm also encouraging the federal government to look at export bans in relation to critical minerals, for example, that we produce here in Canada, the United States can't get in other places. Obviously, BC produces a lot of energy for the United States, electricity as well as natural gas.
Trump will be inaugurated on January 20th, and he's pledged to make tariffs his first order of business. Eby and other premiers will travel to Washington, D.C. on February 12th to meet with Democratic lawmakers and Republican lawmakers to explain the harms those tariffs would cause. Katie DeRosa, CBC News, Victoria.
A coroner's inquest has begun into the 2018 starving death of a BC woman at the hands of her care provider. Florence Gerard, who was born with Down syndrome, was 54 years old when she died while living in the home of Astrid Dahl. Dahl was convicted of failing to provide Gerard the necessaries of life. The CBC's Karen Larson covered the start of the inquest. We spoke with her earlier in the day. Karen, the details of this case, we should warn, quite unsettling.
Florence Gerard was only 50 pounds when she died, Dan, in 2018 in the home of her caregiver, as you mentioned. Today was day one of the coroner's inquest into her death. We heard from Gerard's sister, Sharon Bursey. She testified that Florence was so small that she looked like a child in her casket at the funeral. Bursi compared Florence's home share placement to a prison, saying her bedroom was blocked off with a baby gate, which prevented her from leaving and using the phone. There's a mattress on the floor, and the movie Titanic just playing over and over again on a loop. Bursi also said that Dahl, the caregiver, would never answer the phone when she called, and in fact would sort of screen for her, and she could only ever get through to speak to her sister if she called on someone else's phone. Another thing the court heard is that when Florence died, it had been 4 years since she had last seen a doctor.
What is next in this inquest, Karen?
Well, tomorrow, Astrid Dahl, the caregiver we spoke of, Florence's caregiver, will give testimony, and that's scheduled to run into Wednesday. As you mentioned, she was criminally sentenced to 15 months in prison a few years ago, followed by witnesses from Kinsight. This is the agency contracted by the province to provide this care. It's like adult foster care. They call it home share. The coroner's court is also going to hear from Community Living BC. That's the BC Crown Corporation that funds programs for adults with developmental disabilities. Now, the coroner's court, we should mention, does not find blame. Its purpose is to put forward recommendations to prevent similar deaths in the future.
Karen Larson, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
The Union for Staff at Victoria Libraries says a rising number of violent incidents is causing burnout. In 2024, the Central Branch alone saw almost 600 incidents, 6 times higher than 2021. The union says the problem is making it harder to fill vacancies.
This is obviously something that is really an increasing concern for me personally and for our members at Central Branch and also around the whole system. The number of incidences is increasing quite dramatically. So 5 times increase at Central Branch alone, and a really significant increased burden on staff, and sort of simultaneous with a real staffing crisis that we're starting to feel. It ranges all the way up to utterances of racist name calling or calls for violence. We had some incidences of windows being broken a couple of years ago, and so things like that that are a little bit more scary and a little bit harder for our members to deal with. And again, it's a lot of the same people having to deal with these incidences over and over again. We know that our members are doing their best to really connect with everyone, and they really want to make sure the library is a safe place for everyone to come and be. But we are seeing fewer and fewer staff members having to deal with incidents over and over again just because of reductions in staffing levels across the system, but especially at Central. We know that we currently have a 20% vacancy rate across the whole system, and it's just sort of a lot of extra pressure on those folks. And so then we're also seeing increases in stress leaves, and folks leaving to work at other branches or leaving for other jobs altogether.
Home sales in the province finished 2024 on a stronger note. New data from the BC Real Estate Association shows 4,500 residential units were sold in December. That's almost 25% more than the same period in 2023. The average price also rose to just over $1 million, compared to about $960,000 the year before. The BC government is reminding campers that reservations are beginning to open for this spring. People looking to hit the great outdoors in May can now book in many spots in many campgrounds. That includes 60 new campsites added to the system, 30 in Fintry Park near Kelowna, 17 in Raleigh Lake Park near Mission, and 13 at China Beach Campground in Juan de Fuca Park near Victoria. Campers can book spots up to 4 months in advance, with the much-coveted May long weekend opening later this week. Darius Madavi is here with our look at the weather as we tilt into a bit more cold.
That's right, cold, and if you're in the northwest, wet. If you're anywhere else, dry. You can see that moisture coming in here. That's why we have a rainfall warning in place for Stewart. I'm showing it via the water vapor because we don't have radar coverage up here, but know that there is a decent amount of rain, 50 to 60 millimeters coming down there. Everywhere else in BC, though, quite dry. Ridge of high pressure sitting over us is deflecting all that moisture away. So here, the odd shower popping up on the west coast of the island, but other than that, pretty dry. We're going to continue to see that rain come down and then eventually work its way down to us on Wednesday as that next system rolls through. Clear at times on Wednesday, though, tomorrow and Wednesday. And then that precipitation works its way down the province, Dan, and getting chillier at the end of the week.
Okay, Darius, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Controversial closure. Up next, why Surrey School Board has decided to shut down a specialized program. Stay with us. A Vancouver developer will pay almost $8 million less in rent to the city's school board after the BC Supreme Court issued a ruling this week on Kingsgate Mall. That property is owned by the school board and leased by developer Beatty. Each year, Beatty was to pay the board a portion of what a tribunal ruled was the land's immediate redevelopment value under the lease terms. In 2022, the tribunal set Beatty's annual payment at $9.6 million. But one tribunal member said it should only be $1.6. Beatty sued to get the lower amount and won. One trustee says the ruling shows the district cannot rely on real estate cash.
giving long-term leases and sale like this is really giving away school board property and doesn't allow us to hold it in trust for future generations.
A spokesperson for the district says it's considering its next steps and had not budgeted for the higher rent amount anyway. Well, some parents are worried about the closure of an alternative education program for at-risk students in Surrey. As Michelle Morton reports, the South Surrey White Rock Learning Centre is one of a handful of centres in the city shutting down because of funding constraints.
Before attending South Surrey White Rock Learning Centre, Debbie Weir says mainstream school was a struggle for her child.
They basically went from low C's to B's, high B's, within one semester. And the support that they have, and they're given a voice.
She is concerned about her teen's future now that the school district says the learning center's doors will be closing at the end of this school year, bringing the total number of alternative learning centers in Surrey from 5 to 2 after the Guildford location closed this past November. In a letter to families and students, the Surrey School District says the building's lease expires in June and it requires renovations and repairs.
The renewed costs and the costs to bring the building, the minor renovations, that the wear and tear type of things, those kind of costs that need to occur every time there's a lease renewal, were just outside of our range of affordability.
In a petition, former students are calling on the province and school district to keep the learning center's doors open, calling it a life-saving resource for at-risk youth.
As a queer person, I experienced a lot of bullying and harassment in mainstream schools to the point where threats to my life were made and I was assaulted on school grounds. When I came to the Learning Center, that was the first school that I ever felt safe and respected in.
If you're falling behind, you can catch up a lot faster. If you have a hard schedule, if you have to go to work, they're accommodating to that.
Students from the Learning Center will be enrolled back into secondary schools in the area, where the district says flexible alternative programming will be offered.
There are many reasons why students might not want to return to school. A bad experience with a specific teacher, bullying, and not feeling included. And just with the large size and the overpopulation in our schools, many of these kids just kind of fall through.
The school board says it will work with students and their families to make sure their concerns are addressed. The Ministry of Education adds it's in communication with the school district and knows its priority is supporting students to succeed in school. Michelle Morton, CBC News, Surrey.
A look at the day that was in Kamloops. Cool, crisp and sunny with snow dusting the hills north of the Thompson River. Plenty more of this cool and sunny weather is on the way. Darius has your BC-wide forecast as we tilt into cold. Coming up.
Hi, I'm Amy Bell, and here's what's in your CBC Vancouver inbox.
The CBC concert series Road to the Junos is in Vancouver. The 5-night series kicks off January 26th and continues to January 30th at the Pearl. Get your tickets at cbc.ca/Junos before they're all gone. And never miss a special programming series, event, or contest. Subscribe to CBC Vancouver's e-newsletter and keep connected with us.
I'm Stephen Quinn, and I love living here in Vancouver, BC. It's a city with world-renowned beauty, but it's not all sunshine and rainbows. In our new daily podcast, This is Vancouver, we're exploring the diverse range of issues and stories in the city, the good, the bad, and everything in between, as told by the people who live it every day. Don't miss This is Vancouver, available wherever you get your podcasts, and I'll talk to you soon.
Chrystia Freeland will announce her bid for the Liberal leadership within the next week. Sources have confirmed to Radio Canada that the former finance minister plans to declare her intentions ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration just 7 days from now. Meanwhile, a Nova Scotia MP is pitching himself as the first Indigenous contender to replace Justin Trudeau. Jaime Batiste says First Nations leaders from across the country are encouraging his efforts. When Batiste was elected in 2019, he became Canada's first Mi'kmaq MP. Back to one of our top stories now. This is a critical week for Canadian leaders in their ongoing fight to try to prevent U.S. tariffs. Donald Trump will be sworn in as the next American president in a week, and his threats could be made official that same day. Ottawa says it does have plans to retaliate, but as Ashley Burke explains, one premier says that could trigger a national unity crisis.
After personally meeting with Donald Trump, Alberta's premier says Canada needs to get ready for U.S. tariffs next week.
We do need to be preparing ourselves for the fact that they're likely to come in on January 20th.
Smith spoke to Trump at Mar-a-Lago on Saturday and a golf course the next day. She says Trump seems undeterred to impose a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods.
I haven't seen anything that suggests that he's changing course. So our job is going to be to work overtime to make sure that we can make the case for carve-outs if that potential does happen.
The Prime Minister says if that does happen, he will take action.
And we are ready to respond with tariffs as necessary.
His Foreign Affairs Minister says a retaliation plan is in the works.
I can't go into the details of that retaliation plan because I think it would be a bad strategy, but what I can tell you is everything is on the table.
Ontario's premier, who's already threatened to cut off electricity south of the border, insists nothing should be ruled out.
I'm not speaking for Premier Smith, but we have to use all the tools possible when our country's under attack economically, when our province is under attack economically. You just don't roll over.
Some say anything but a united front is helping, not hurting Trump.
I don't think it helps for different premiers to be delivering different messages to the United States. That just plays into Donald Trump's hands.
Premiers will meet with the Prime Minister on Wednesday to all try and get on the same page. They want to know exactly what Ottawa's plan is and what's on its list of potential retaliatory measures. Ashley Burke, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now, the threat of sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods coming into the U.S. seems to be growing in likelihood. Incoming U.S. President Donald Trump claims the U.S. is, quote, subsidizing Canada. Andrew Chang, host of About That, looks at what Trump's subsidy allegations mean and if the math is correct.
Donald Trump has said over and over again, the U.S. is subsidizing Canada.
We are subsidizing Canada to the tune of over $100 billion a year.
The United States is subsidizing Canada.
As I called him Governor Trudeau, I said, listen, what would happen if we didn't subsidize you? Because we give them a lot of money. It's very unfair.
But what does Trump mean exactly? Subsidizing Canada to the tune of over $100 billion a year. And is it true? We should start by saying that everyone is partly guessing what Trump means when he talks about the U.S. subsidizing Canada, because he hasn't actually explained where he's getting this $100 billion number from. And the number sometimes changes with a whole bunch of other grievances getting thrown into the pot.
Why are we supporting a country, $200 billion plus a year? Our military is at their disposal. All of these other things, they should be a state.
But let's pick up on what appears, at least most of the time, to be driving this claim about the U.S. subsidizing Canada, and that's the trade imbalance between the two countries.
Donald Trump has always been obsessed with trade balances, trade surpluses and deficits, and the fact that the U.S. has a trade deficit.
We're spending hundreds of billions a year to take care of Canada. We lose in trade deficits.
A trade deficit happens when country A imports more from country B than it exports. And Trump's right on one central point. The U.S. does have an ongoing trade deficit with Canada. And that's been the case for years. Canada has, in fact, sold more goods to the United States than the U.S. has sold to Canada. And zooming in on 2023, for example, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the hard numbers are pretty clear. Canada exported $427 billion worth of goods to the US, while the US exported $355 billion worth of goods to Canada. The difference between those two numbers, about 72 billion US, or about 100 billion Canadian.
He talks about, I'm a trader, I love trade, I want so much trade, but it has to be fair. But what he means by fair is that if the US has a surplus, it's fair. If the US has a deficit, it's unfair.
So maybe that's where Trump is getting this $100 billion figure from. Except if that's the case, it's misleading. Because what I just showed you was the trade deficit in goods, physical things. But think of all the other things that Americans sell to Canadians, from financial services, telecommunications, air transport, consulting, hell, even Netflix.
It's very important to look at services as well, because services has been a growing part of trade for many decades now.
Yes, any honest accounting of a trade imbalance must take services into account, because that's trade. And when you look at that balance sheet in services, the US actually has a surplus over Canada of about $32 billion US, which doesn't wipe out the deficit in goods, but it certainly pulls the two countries a little closer together. The actual total trade imbalance between Canada and the US is about $40 billion US, or 57 billion Canadian, in Canada's favor. But let's set aside the number, because like I said at the start, I don't know if it's clear to anyone where Trump is getting his numbers from, because he hasn't explained it, even when asked. But there is a bigger question here about how Trump appears to be framing the trade imbalance as some sort of subsidy to Canada.
So I think what he's saying implicitly, we're giving more dollars to Canada than they're spending in the U.S. And he thinks that's a subsidy.
He's just saying the very fact that there's a trade deficit shows that we must be subsidizing things in some fashion. And that's not the case.
Right, because when we think of subsidies, we tend to think of handouts, right? Except it's not like the US is just sending Canada $40 billion a year for nothing in return. Like when I buy a $6 jar of mayonnaise from Walmart, that's not a subsidy. I'm buying mayonnaise. And Americans are simply buying more from Canada than Canadians buy from Americans. And experts we spoke to say that's not necessarily a bad thing.
There's nothing inherently good or bad about a trade surplus or a deficit. The United States has had a trade deficit pretty much since the end of the Second World War. Why is that? Because they're richer than any other country, so they buy more stuff.
And consider this, the US's $40 billion trade deficit with Canada pales in comparison to its trade deficit with many other countries. Just look at how much more the US buys from China each year, for example. That gap is more than $250 billion.
So Canada only accounts for about 5% of the overall U.S. deficit just in terms of traded goods. It's not even in the top 5 countries that have a larger surplus.
But let's go one level deeper with Trump's argument, because what he's actually been trying to get across is that the U.S. doesn't actually need any of the stuff it's buying from Canada, and that it's only been buying Canadian products to essentially help Canada out. That's the subsidy.
We're doing it because of habit, and we're doing it because we like our neighbors, and we've been good neighbors. But we can't do it forever. You know, they make 20% of our cars. We don't need that. I'd rather make them in Detroit.
And it's not just cars. It's also
lumber. We have massive fields of lumber. We don't need their dairy products. We have more than they have. We don't need anything.
So now we're starting to understand his point, that he believes the U.S. can and should produce all of these things domestically instead of paying Canada for them.
The America First movement, not just Trump, but the America First movement and the economists who are part of it are fixated on the deficit as synonymous with job loss in the U.S.
And that's certainly an argument you can make from industry to industry. If you set aside the notion that the whole reason you buy things instead of make things is because making things is often more expensive. But if Trump really believes that the U.S. buys too much from Canada, he is leaving one big thing out. The one daily purchase that makes up about a quarter of everything Americans buy from Canadians. The U.S. produces more crude oil than any other country in the world, around 13 million barrels a day. But for its own citizens, it needs more than that, about 20 million barrels a day. And it can't even efficiently use a big chunk of what it does produce, because historically, American refineries have been set up to process a different, heavier kind of oil than American drillers can find in their own shale deposits. So that's an expensive problem. But you know who produces exactly the kind of heavy crude oil America needs? You guessed it. The U.S. buys the majority, around 60% of the crude oil it needs from Canada. And on some level, it makes sense. Canada is a relatively stable energy partner. Pipelines make transporting oil a lot easier.
Because of the distance, because of pre-existing supply chain links, because of transportation routes. This is why Canada and the U.S. trade the most.
And one other way to look at Canada's trade surplus.
If you remove oil, we're now running a trade deficit with the United States.
It's largely one commodity in our case. And that commodity is not putting Americans out of work. It's putting Americans to work.
Putting Americans to work because of what I just mentioned a few moments ago, that there is an entire industry built around the importation of heavy Canadian crude and all the American workers who process and refine that oil domestically.
Oil and gas is probably one of the best examples of how something that is responsible for a huge trade deficit is actually creating tens of thousands of jobs in the U.S.
Now, Trump has signaled that he intends to ramp up domestic drilling, too. But to use all of that oil domestically, there would have to be a significant and expensive retooling of America's refining capacity as well. That doesn't happen overnight. So in the meantime, Americans buy a ton of oil from Canada. And that is the single biggest driver of the trade deficit that Donald Trump says is a big, big problem.
If it were to be interrupted, I know it would harm Canada, but it also would get the attention, I think, of U.S. policymakers because there are parts of and regions of the U.S. that very much depend on those imports.
So, yes, the U.S. has a trade imbalance with Canada. No, that doesn't mean the U.S. is subsidizing Canada's economy. But yes, Trump can and will likely continue to argue that it should be buying less from Canada and producing more at home. How easy that is to actually do is one question. Another is how much of all of this is just part of one long, dramatic negotiation.
The winds are picking up again in Los Angeles, threatening progress in fighting those relentless wildfires. Almost 30 people are confirmed dead, and nearly as many people are missing. We'll have more from Southern California after the break. There are signs Israel and Hamas may be on the verge of a deal to end the war in Gaza and they release the hostages being held there. A deal would bring relief to Palestinians after more than a year of fighting and now the cold weather, and hope for families in Israel calling for the safe return of their loved ones. More now from Chris Brown.
A ceasefire may be close, but in Gaza there was no respite from the pounding of Israeli bombs. 40 people were killed in attacks near a northern hospital and a former school turned shelter. Israel also continues to suffer losses, with 9 soldiers killed in Gaza in the past 48 hours. With Donald Trump set to take over in a week, his team, along with the current Biden administration, have been pressing both sides to compromise.
On the war between Israel and Hamas, we're on the brink of a proposal that I laid out in detail months ago, finally coming to fruition.
Israel's government says its goal is to destroy Hamas, but while badly damaged, the militant group persists, with Gaza in ruins. The UN estimates 2/3 of the buildings are damaged or destroyed, with most people crammed into temporary shelters that can't protect the most vulnerable from the elements. Noura Albatran's infant son froze to death, one of 8 newborns killed by the cold in recent weeks. My child died in front of my eyes, and I couldn't do anything for him, she told our videographer. The tiny baby's twin brother also suffered from hypothermia, but he was saved. Dr. Ahmed Al-Farah says many of his tiny patients come from families sheltering in damaged buildings.
The main step for saving this child is to stop this war.
But despite the urgency for a deal, some are trying to stop it. Families of Israeli hostages who've repeatedly had their hopes brutally dashed screamed at the country's far-right finance minister, who called the potential agreement a catastrophe for Israel. Based on reports, Hamas would initially release 33 Israeli hostages, and Israel would free Palestinians held prisoner. A second round of negotiations would focus on the release of the remaining hostages, and Israel would withdraw from the Gaza Strip. Another round of negotiations is set for Tuesday to try to get the deal done. Chris Brown, CBC News, London.
As we told you earlier, winds are picking up again in Los Angeles as crews try to preserve their work against those wildfires. Gusts overnight could be more than 100 kilometers an hour. Officials have issued a red flag warning Tuesday into Wednesday. That's the same kind of warning issued before the fires that caused all that destruction. Lindsay Duncombe spent the day talking to Canadians fighting the blaze, and the forecast has them worried.
It happens so quickly. A report of a new fire comes in, this one near Santa Clarita. In minutes, Quebec pilot Pascal Duclos is in action, launching his Super Scooper aircraft, another mission on a deployment like no other.
Everybody is tired of to work in the fire, the resources, and hope we don't get a big fire for this week.
We are not in the clear as of yet, and we must not let our guard down.
Consider Los Angeles Airport has recorded less than 1 millimeter of rain in the last 180 days, a fraction of what's normal. In those parched conditions, embers whipped by wind could spread the flames fast. Planes are dropping retardant on dry brush preemptively.
We're going to be patrolling, taking a proactive approach. Anywhere where there's any wildland risk is where we're going to be patrolling. It's just extra set of eyes, ears.
Fear of more fire in a city just coming to grips with how much has been lost. More than 12,000 structures, many of them homes, gone. At least 24 people are dead, and the search for the missing isn't over.
For the Altadena area, we are in the 3rd day of grid searching. It is a very grim task, and we, unfortunately, every day we're doing this, we're running across the remains of individual community members.
Across the city, volunteers are stepping up, doing what they can, even as they worry about what's next.
We're like, let's go help. We have to, because we could easily be the next victims.
There's more help from Canada, too. BC's Coulson Aviation has helicopters in the firefight.
Truth of the matter is the bell could ring here in the building 4 seconds from now and we're back in the aircraft and it's game on.
They've attacked fires all over Canada.
I'm John. Nice to meet you, John. Pleasure.
Australia, too. But nothing like this.
We're all pretty tired, exhausted, and a little nervous right now.
Darius Madavi is here with our BC-wide forecast, but to better explain why they may be nervous in LA.
Right, so those winds are picking up as we heard, but also just the prevailing conditions are perfect for fires to really be taking off. And so you can see here, and in terms of the fire weather forecast, as we get through the day tomorrow, we're going to see spikes at times reaching up to a 6. That is very, very high. Now, this is a, it's a relative scale, but we're getting up towards that extreme end of it. We're going to see those high winds bring those dry and hot conditions that are perfect for fires to really take off. And especially concerning is the idea of those embers being picked up from these fires that are, more contained. Some of these fire perimeters, if we take a look here, are smaller. They are very much contained, but they're still burning inside that perimeter. So those embers can be picked up and taken long ways away. Now, we have these fire weather warnings, these red flag warnings in place. You'd usually only expect to see ones to this level, the level that the National Weather Service has issued, 5 to 10 years. That's how often you'd expect to see them. This is the second time in a week that they've been issued. So very concerning situation in place from tomorrow night through Wednesday. Here are those fire perimeters. Some of these still Palisade Fire 14% contained, Eaton Fire 33% contained, so still far from being out of the woods. And as again those winds pick up, we could see those winds being, as they move along these fires, picking up embers and really dropping them anywhere in LA, which is why those warnings are so widespread. Now, let's take a look here in BC where conditions are quite a bit different. We do have some winds picking up in a few places, but the real weather story is going to be that precipitation and those temperatures. Coming up into the northwest, the rest of BC, though, under a ridge of high pressure, deflecting that precipitation away from us, so just staying up there. But we are going to see it eventually make its way down, spreading a few showers down the south coast and some flurries into the interior Wednesday into Thursday. Now, when that happens, we're also going to see temperatures drop. We're not going to see it too much with these highs. As I roll through this map, you can see a little bit dropping in the north and through the central interior, but not much. The lows paint a better picture, though. You can see here quite a bit above seasonal, many areas, especially in the central interior and up in the north. But as we roll through this, and as we get into Wednesday, and especially Thursday, here we go, big drop in temperature pretty much across the board, getting closer to what we'd normally expect to see at this time of year. Now, conditions across the province tomorrow, bit of sunshine many places, but also a little bit unsettled in others. So a lot of places seeing that snow transitioning into rain early in the morning. And there we go, Dan, 5-day forecast. We got some fog on the way. We've got some sunshine, a few showers on Thursday, and then those chilly overnight lows to round out the week.
Okay, let's take a quick deep breath.
Oh, yes.
You're going to tell us how construction materials could help address climate change. What's this about?
Right. So we build a lot. I don't know if you've noticed. And we also need to find ways to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and put it somewhere. So this is called carbon capture. You've probably heard a lot about it. But the question is, where do we put it after we pull it out? Some people have suggested pumping it far underground, but that has its own problems. That's a whole other story. But if there are other ways to do it, that would be great. And this is one example. This is biochar, and you can actually use it as the aggregate when you make concrete, which is a big deal. There's actually a whole list of materials that you can use for this sort of thing. Here we go. Just a whole list of things that we can use captured carbon in order to sequester it. Because when we build something, we ideally want it to stay up for a long time anyway. Now, if we actually roll this back a little bit, the number one that I want to talk about, the most important, is... Here we go. Concrete. This is actually huge. We use almost 20 billion tons of concrete every single year. If we are able to put sequestered carbon into that, it could go a very long way to helping us pull it out of the atmosphere.
Good to know. Thanks, Darius.
Thank you.
Scientists in Antarctica find a frozen piece of history over 1 million years old. What it could tell us about Earth's past and future. Next.
A team of scientists in Antarctica have been studying a piece of ice drilled from deep below the polar surface. It dates back more than 1 million years.
Karen Paul's now on how the ice core could help solve mysteries about Earth's changing climate.
Deep in Antarctica, at a remote research station, a team of scientists has been drilling into the ice to the rock nearly 3 kilometers down. They've extracted an ice core that, when laid out end to end, is longer than 8 Eiffel Towers and provides a record of 1.2 million years of Earth's climate, the first of its kind.
It's just an enormous success. We're so thrilled.
Suspended in the ice are ancient air bubbles and particles scientists hope will solve a mystery about Earth's climate history. Specifically, what happened 900,000 to 1.2 million years ago when Earth's climate became less predictable, more rapidly changing between cold and warm periods. Some researchers say our ancestors came close to extinction. Scientists believe CO2 and other greenhouse gases were responsible. Preliminary research suggests levels then were as high as they are today.
It's a riddle for us. We just don't understand what causes the climate to change like that.
But this isn't the oldest ice discovered. That was retrieved last year in Antarctica by American scientists, dating back 6 million years. Princeton's John Higgins says this research is especially important at a time when some people still don't believe in climate change.
Ice cores give us really a unique record of Earth's past in that they trap little bits of essentially ancient atmosphere. And so they're really the closest you can get to going back in a time machine and being able to measure what the atmosphere was like in the past, with an idea about, how those might be relevant for understanding how Earth's climate might change in the future.
This latest sample is being kept at minus 50 degrees Celsius. It's being cleaned and cut into pieces so it can be transported to labs around Europe, where scientists will do their analysis. The first results expected late this year. Karen Pauls, CBC News, Winnipeg.
8 Eiffel Towers.
Not bad.
Measure everything in Eiffel Towers. Thanks for being with us tonight on CBC Vancouver News at 6.
And we'll have your next local news at 11 o'clock, right after the national. Good night.